We're going to start in Philippians 1. We'll read the section as we start. It will not be on the screen, and then everything else will be. So Philippians chapter 1, and we will begin in verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. I was thinking of how best to consider this morning, and there was a phrase that came to mind that I have heard a bunch of times before, and I actually found myself having to Google it to figure out who said it. And you may have heard this before too, but Stephen R. Covey once said, "The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing." And I like the way he puts this. This is intended for business people, but I think it really applies to who we are as Christians. We have that greatest command that Jesus gives: love God, love your neighbor. And then when it comes to what is our task to do as Christians, I think the next thing that comes along for us is the gospel. And unfortunately, what I also recognize is it doesn't take a lot to distract us sometimes. Whether it's life getting difficult and so we begin to assume there's something else that's more important at the time, whether it's something that maybe interests us a little more, although we probably wouldn't admit that out loud, something maybe we get a little more excited about. I had to, as part of a class that I'm doing right now, I had to ask my wife a question about what are I can't remember if it was what my aspirations are or what my interests are, the things I'm passionate about. And she said to me, Alabama football. And I said, all right, that's fair enough. I do get excited about that. And what else? And she said, not sure. It's largely Alabama football. And I'm sure there are other things, but you don't really tend to talk about those other things quite as much. And I realized very quickly, there's a part of me that wants to get defensive and say, well, hang on just a minute. You're clearly not listening to the things I'm saying, but I know better. And I realized she's right. That too often I get really impassioned about things that, as much as it pains me to say, don't matter, like Alabama football, that I don't think about the things that really do matter. I don't get caught up in the things that are most important. And so as Paul teaches in this section here of Philippians 1, I think what he is trying to remind us of largely here is that we've got to keep the main thing the main thing. And it's so easy for things to get in the way of that, but we have to keep coming back to the main thing being the main thing. So what is the main thing? And I've let you in a little bit on this already. We've got love God, we've got love our neighbor, but when it comes to the thing we are to do, once it gets past that, above gathering here together, I believe, above even some of the things we do that we may think are particulars of us as the church, the main thing for us, the most important thing, the task that we talked about last Sunday night, that Jesus left his disciples with right as he was going to leave the earth, is the gospel. The main thing for us is the gospel and taking it to everyone. So he says, beginning in Philippians 1:12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. It is the gospel for Paul. As he looks at all of these things that have happened to him, still the main thing, the most important thing, is the gospel. So I want you to think about for a moment when you think, what has happened to Paul? And I know we can, from what we know about studying Paul and his letters and what he does in the book of Acts, we could probably put together a pretty good list of the things he's suffered, and sometimes we'll gloss over just a few of the bigger ones. But Paul does it for us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24, he says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day, and I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. For me, occasionally I will look out and someone is asleep. That's the struggle I go through. Sometimes people will think you're a minister and they will kind of shake your head as if you have come up with something lesser to do in life. Sometimes for us as Christians, we will have a standard about something, and there will be those who their immediate reaction is to think, well, that is just silly. I read a book not too long ago about leadership, and I was troubled in the book because the author, and this is, by the way, I was talking about this with someone yesterday. Every now and then I will use something from a book on leadership in a sermon or in a bulletin article, and this one has a lot of good stuff in it, but I've intentionally not quoted anything from it because of the author's language. And I got midway into it and I thought, why does this author have to punctuate everything this way? Why does this person feel like the only way I can make my point is by using some words that would not make it into a PG-13 movie? And I'm frustrated by it as I read it, but yet if I tell someone who is out in the world that this frustrates me about this book, they think I'm being childish about it. They think, well, this is how people talk, Brian, don't you understand? This is, if you really want to make your point, if you really want to drive it home, this is how you have to say that. And for a lot of you, you work in environments that are like that. For a lot of you, you maybe have bought into some of that yourself. And I will tell you as I read through that, you don't have to say those things. You don't have to talk in that way. And maybe that's the place where we feel some of what Paul feels on a much lower level. And so we may say to Paul, I've suffered for this too. I'm misunderstood. People sometimes will persecute me because of the gospel. And Paul says, even in spite of all this, the gospel is still the most important thing. He says, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. So if all these big giant things are not enough, Paul says, oh, and by the way, daily anxiety. And maybe this is the place where we can connect with Paul. Now, I like to think that all of our anxiety is about the church. I like to think that all of my anxiety is about the church. But in reality, it's not, is it? We have anxiety that comes from all kinds of other places. And unfortunately for a lot of us, it may never have anything to do with church and our concern about we want the church to grow. We want more people to know about the gospel. We want to make sure our relationships are right. We want to make sure we're forgiving and being forgiven. Our anxiety doesn't necessarily come from there, but we do understand the idea of daily anxiety. And so Paul says, even with all of these things I've suffered, it's the gospel. It has really served to advance the gospel. So could we say the same thing? Could we look at, if we were to list a list of things out like Paul's, and my guess is that most of ours would not be anything remotely close to what Paul went through. I mentioned September 12th to you as we began today. We spent a couple hours last evening watching a documentary about the 4 flights on September 11th, 2001. And as I was watching it, I was blown away by the real people. You see the big number and you are so taken by that, you're so frustrated by what happened. You think it's such an awful thing, but as I start looking at individuals, I look at a guy whose wife was on Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania, whose wife and unborn child were on that flight, would have been their first child together. And to hear him talk about it, even 20 years later, as his voice begins to break a little bit, and I start to think to myself, as these people tell their stories and the things they have made of it 20 years later, the things where they have tried to pull something good out of the bad, if we look at the persecution, the suffering, the anxiety that we may have had somewhere along the way in life because of the gospel, could we say the same thing as Paul, that even with all of that we are satisfied to know that it is advancing the gospel? And if we could not say that, why? Shouldn't we be people that are trying in all of the things that we experience in life to be pointing people towards Christ? So how has this advanced the gospel? If Paul is convinced here in verse 12 that all these things he's gone through that he describes in 2 Corinthians, if they have all served to advance the gospel, if the fact that he currently doesn't have freedom because he is either imprisoned in a home in a house of some kind, or he's imprisoned in a dungeon of some kind, whichever it may be, and he looks at that writing this letter, how has this served to advance the gospel? Now, I think there are 5 ways that we'll look at. First of all, it has provided a captive audience. I have seen more than one commentator mention this as he's imprisoned, and it makes me laugh a little bit because it's the worst pun ever, but it's very true. Paul has an audience that has no choice but to listen. And so he makes use of that. In verse 13 he says, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. My wife and I have had a discussion this week about who is the imperial guard and where are they, and does this point to it being in a real prison and not a house prison? And it could be one of those things where it's either one. But what we see here is that because there are people that have to make sure that Paul's where he's supposed to be, whether it's in a house or in a dungeon, they have to listen to Paul, whether they necessarily want to or not. And so Paul is going to make use of that time through teaching, through example, we learn through singing, all kinds of things. He's going to tell those people about Christ. So none of us, I'm assuming, since we're here this morning, unless you have an ankle bracelet on I don't know about, none of us are imprisoned. But at the same time, all of us have people that have to put up with us for a certain amount of time, don't we? Some of the people live in our house and they have to put up with us and we tell them all kinds of things. Some people are our co-workers and we tell them all kinds of things. Some people are the people at the checkout line at the store. I know from talking with some of you love the self-checkout and some of you are vehemently against the self-checkout. And if you are against the self-checkout, then you are standing 2 feet away from someone every time you go shopping. And they have to at least hear what you have to say. Unfortunately, by the way, I have witnessed far too many people use this in a bad way. And they have told the people at the self-checkout, or not at the real checkout, about everything wrong in the world, about everything that's going on, instead of having the opportunity to talk to them about something good. If you go out to eat after we leave here today, you will have a waiter or a waitress, or I guess we say server nowadays, that will be at your table, and you have an opportunity to be an example to that person. I mentioned to you, David and I went to eat with Lanny Tucker from EEM at Polo's several weeks ago. And when the waitress came to our table, he asked her out of the blue, we're here, he told her what we're doing. We're here talking about Bibles in Eastern Europe, and we do ministry work. Is there anything we can pray about for you? And I thought, that's kind of cool. He's not even from here. He's never been to Polo's before, and he's viewed this as an opportunity to just set the tone here for what this is. And sure enough, the waitress had something. And she said, well, you can pray about this. First, she was taken aback, by the way. But then when she came back with the drink, she said, I actually do have something. And she told us something that we could pray about. And we did as we sat there at the table. And I thought, here is a moment where we can use that captive audience in a good way. And secondly, within that, I think we also see that it has become known, which means how? There is multiplication that is going on. So not only does he have a captive audience, but he is not speaking to the entire imperial guard, is he? He's probably speaking to one or two people. I imagine there's shifts of some kind that are going on wherever he is, but the imperial guard is a very large group of people. And I don't believe Paul is exaggerating when he says they all know. How do they all know? It's not because Paul has the perfect sermon for that moment that he has said. It is because Paul has told or been an example to them, and they have gone out and they have said to someone else at the break time or at a meal, you're not going to believe this guy we've got in prison. You know how everybody else, like in the cartoons, is chalking up on the wall the marks of what day they're at? You know how everyone else is complaining about the food? You know how everybody else is trying to come up with a plan to break out? These guys are talking about the reason they are there is so worthwhile. These guys are talking about that guy that was crucified several years back, and they truly believe that that guy came back from the dead, and now they think he is the Son of God, and they've told us all about who he is and what he's done. And then the people at lunch that day told the people they went to dinner with later that evening, who told other people, who told other people. And gradually everybody found out. So Paul takes this captive audience to begin with, and then it spreads from there. I like to think that that day at Polo's, that waitress went home, and she talked to whoever is there at her home and said, you're not going to believe this guy from lunch today. He's not even from here. And he asked me, is there something you can pray about? And whoever she's having meal with that night says, what'd you tell him? Well, I told him that there's this thing I'm concerned about, and they were going to pray about it. And he told me at the end of the meal, they prayed about it. They even left me a decent tip, which I think we did that day. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure we did. Good way to finish that meal. And so there is an impact that's made on her that then can carry on to someone else. And I don't know what result will come of that. I like to think there's an imperial guard church somewhere in Rome. I don't know that that happened. But there are people that knew the story because Paul viewed this as an opportunity not just for this captive audience, but that they would tell others too. So he says, again, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest, and we don't really know who he's talking about. There are other people outside the guard that the imprisonment is for Christ. Then third, it built confidence in the believers. It built confidence in people. In verse 14 it says, "And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." So they look and say, Paul can do it. And even when things don't go well for Paul, what does Paul do? Does he run and hide? Does Paul stop what he's saying? Does Paul do something differently? No. Paul keeps doing it. And I've met Paul. Paul is just a regular person like I am. And if Paul can, then I can. And so they gain a confidence. I believe that's part of why these stories are here in the Gospels and in the letters of Paul and in the other parts of the New Testament for us. And even the heroes of the Old Testament is just to remind us that God working in these people, if they can do these things, then so can I and so can you. And so part of Paul's imprisonment serves to bring us the confidence that we can do these things too. Then number 4, provides motivation. And we will see, by the way, that not all motivation is the same. In verse 15, he says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill." Xenophon, who was in the 5th century BC, he was a Greek philosopher and historian, he says, "The envious are those annoyed only at their friends' successes." I think a lot of times we put envy in the place of, this is that thing I want, and so the envy is serving in that way. This philosopher says, a big part of your envy is just the fact that someone else is successful, and you're bothered by that. And I think of this happening, 2,500 years ago now? This is how our country operates, isn't it? We try to pit rich and poor against each other, and that envy that is built says that if someone else is successful, then somehow that means that I'm not successful, and so I don't like that person now. And what Paul sees is there are those who are doing this thing for envy, those who are doing it for good. Maybe a little more clear way of saying this is envy is more set on depriving the other person of the desired thing than to gain it. How pointless is that? How unproductive is that? If you have ever found yourself here in one of these two descriptions of envy, how has that turned out for you? Has it bettered your life? Has it motivated you to do something about those things other than just dislike the other person more, or maybe try to find some way to get even with that other person? So envy doesn't serve us very well. It continues in verse 16, "The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment." I'm thinking of Diotrephes from 3 John that we were looking at in class this morning. David said he never knew anyone in church like that. I'm glad David has never known anyone in church like that. I've heard lots of stories. And I can't really put my finger on a whole lot of those myself, and I'm glad of that. But there are people within church that this is kind of how they operate. It's all out of selfishness. It's all out of ambition. It's all out of envy. And so Paul says you've got these different motivations, but I don't care about that. These people are motivated by different things, but their motivation doesn't matter as long as the gospel is being spread. And they can like me or not like me. They could be doing it in a way to complement what I'm doing, or in a way that they think they're getting back at me somehow because they're free and I'm not, or however they're looking at it. But regardless of it, if the gospel is being spread, then I'm good with it. I was thinking of if you were saved in a physical sense, we'll get outside of spiritual things for a moment. If someone saved your life, would you care what motivated them to do it? I think of, I was on a mountain climbing trip with our youth group, a mountain hiking trip with our youth group years ago. And there was a girl who had come as a visitor with our group. She was a friend of somebody in the group. Her name was Mallory. And there was a day that we were rappelling down a mountain. I say we, that's the royal we. They were rappelling down the mountain. I was taking pictures. They were rappelling down the mountain. It's a 200-foot cliff face that they're coming down. Mallory gets about a third of the way down, and she has her long hair tucked up into the helmet that she wore. I always laugh that you're on a 200-foot cliff face with a helmet on, as if that's going to matter. But she has her hair tucked up into the helmet. About a third of the way down, her hair comes loose, and her hair comes down and gets caught between the rope and the S-hook thing that holds her harness to the rope, and she cannot move. She is stuck about 80 feet down a 200-foot cliff face and can't do anything. And she's yelling up the mountain to, I'm stuck, nothing I can do. The person beside her is trying to relay information up. And so one of our guides, they're all college students, by the way, one of our guides who know what they're doing, I don't mean to sell that short, one of our guides gets his harness on and gets his helmet on and starts down the side of the mountain. And I'm watching all this unfold. A youth minister thinking, if I lose a youth group member visitor on this trip, does my job go with that? How does this work? So I'm watching it and watching all this happen, and the only way out of this predicament is when he gets to her, is to take his knife out of his pocket and cut her hair off at that level. And all the women suddenly shudder. But Mallory at that moment really didn't care, and she had a short haircut after we were done. But anyhow, he cuts her hair out, and she comes down the mountain. And I will tell you, I would guess for Mallory, and I know never for me as youth minister, never did it go through my mind. Is Dustin coming down the side of the mountain because he fears his job with the outfitter that he's working with, and he doesn't want to lose a student on the side of the mountain either? Is he coming down the mountain because he wants to save a life and this is a cool story to tell? Is he coming down the side because this is the right thing to do? Is he coming out of real concern for Mallory, who he just met the previous day? I have no idea. When Dustin got to the bottom and Mallory got to the bottom and I was down there already because I'm taking pictures, I went over and I patted him on the back and said, "Good job." I found out at that moment that Dustin hates rappelling almost as much as I do. And it's the one part of the thing he normally doesn't do. He has trained to do it and he knows how. But if he can avoid it on a trip, he never does it. He loves to climb 14ers. I'm still friends with him on Facebook. He hit the last of the Colorado 14ers this summer. He's done all of them now. He loves that, hates the rappelling, but knew he had to come down the side and help Mallory out because he was the only one that could come down. Everyone else was at the top doing their jobs. And so he came down the side to save. Now, the people that are preaching the gospel alongside Paul here, some of them have very good intent, some of them very bad intent. And what Paul says is, all I care about is the fact that the gospel is being spread. Again, the main thing has to stay the main thing. Does the motivation matter to Paul? It doesn't. Maybe, is there a little piece of him that might be annoyed by it at times? I'd have a hard time thinking that's never there, but that doesn't matter. What matters to him is that the gospel is being spread. So what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. So number 5, he has made the gospel job one. It doesn't matter the motivation. It doesn't matter the audience. It doesn't matter the technique. As long as we are true to what the gospel is, and we're going to be people who preach the gospel, then the gospel has to be job one. So Paul's example, Donald Carson says in Basics for Believers, Paul's example is impressive and clear. Put the advance of the gospel at the center of your aspirations. Our own comfort, our bruised feelings, our reputations, our misunderstood motives, all of these are insignificant in comparison with the advance and splendor of the gospel. As Christians, we are called upon to put the advance of the gospel at the very center of our aspirations. What are your aspirations? To make money? To get married? To travel? To see your grandchildren grow up? To find a new job? To retire early? None of these is inadmissible. None is to be despised. The question is whether these aspirations become so devouring that the Christian's central aspiration is squeezed to the periphery or choked out of existence entirely. Is gospel number one for you? What is your main thing? Because if we're going to keep the main thing, we have to know what the main thing is. And for us, we are to love God, we are to love others, and we are to spread the good news of Jesus to everyone. The reason I asked the question in the title, good news or bad news, you've probably had that somewhere along the way. Hopefully not from your doctor who comes in and says, do you want the good news or the bad news? That's not the best time for this. But so often you may hear that, and a lot of us are geared towards, well, give me the bad news so we can end on the good, or give me the good news and then I'll be ready for the bad. And I will tell you that for us as Christians, whatever the bad news is, it pales in comparison. It just falls so totally behind the good news. Paul has a lot of bad news, but he doesn't lead with that, does he? It is the gospel first and foremost. And if you have never heard that good news until today, I believe it can change your life. You can confess his name, be baptized, and your life can be changed. Or if you have fallen too far into the bad news that you have lost sight of the good, you can come back today. If there's something we can help you with, something we can pray about in your life, please come forward or the class in the middle as we stand and sing.